Okay. So, I found this paper called Multispecies Studies Cultivating Arts of Attentiveness, and I thought that it was really appropriate for our group. Um, it's in the journal Environmental Humanities, um, and it's open access, so anyone can read it. It's free to download, and if you find this interesting, I recommend you read the original. And you can have a look at all the other papers that they have, which all look really interesting. So I'm just going to be summarizing it. None of this is my ideas or anything, and I only read the paper a few days ago, so um, I'm I might not be summarizing it perfectly. So again, I recommend reading the original if you find this interesting. Okay, it's not working. Oh, there we go. All right. Okay, so basically, multi-species studies operate on the assumption that all beings exist in relation to others, such that their existence is inseparable from the web of relations. This relation to others exists both in the present and because of past coevolution. And because of this interdependence, beings are always in a state of flux, and so being is more accurately described as becoming. Multispecies studies is an umbrella term drawing together interdisciplinary approaches, united by a common interest in better understanding what is at stake, ethically, politically, epistemologically, for different forms of life caught up in diverse relationships of knowing and living together. It draws upon traditional scientific knowledge as well as the relational thinking of indigenous peoples. As anthropologist Anat Singh says, human nature, in all its myriad forms, is an interspecies relation. And so the authors argue that stories that center only on the human will not be helpful in the current and emerging age, the Anthropocene, also known as many other names such as the Capitalocene. And instead, we need detailed practices of attentiveness to the complex ways that we, all of us, become in consequential relationship with others. Multi-species studies connect the life sciences with political questions. For example, what will count as conservation in our post-natural world? How must we rethink the human after the anthropocentric bubble has burst? What forms of responsibility are required, and how might we learn to respond in other, perhaps better ways to the communities taking form in blasted landscapes? These questions are answered in multi-species studies by researchers immersing themselves in the natural world they study. So, what does this immersion look like? Multi-species studies focuses on the entangled relations between things that both include and exceed the dynamics between the different roles in nature, such as predator and prey, parasite and host, researchers and researched, symbiotic partner, or indifferent neighbor. This immersive approach is also applied to what most consider non-living systems, such as weather and AI, that can be thought of as having lives and entanglements worthy of the attention of researchers. Whether and how this could be useful in understanding the boundary between life and not life is an open question. Another important feature in this area is that although the term species is used, it does not assume the Western scientific mode of taxonomy or imply fixed homogeneous kinds. It leads to questions about what species means and how they engage and entangle with each other. What follows is an overview of the dominant modes of immersion that ground and guide multi-species studies research. Passionate immersion goes beyond the shallow ways of engaging with research subjects, as treating them as mere symbols, resources, or backgrounds in the lives of humans, and instead aims to provide richer accounts of the distinctive experiential worlds, modes of being, and biocultural attachments of other species. Passionate immersion means becoming curious and entangled, and learning to understand and care a little differently. A lot of this work is interdisciplinary in a deep sense. It is not just the meeting of two disciplines, but a complete merging, akin to the research done centuries ago before the boundaries between distinct disciplines in academia were drawn. It brings values into clear view in the research rather than uncritically acting within them, including rereadings of established literatures, attentive to historical contexts and the complex ways in which scientific practices and knowledges are shaped by politics, gender, and the positionality of the observer. Fieldwork is also important, including observing the scientists that observe the non-human life. The lab can provide a controlled environment where results can easily be reproduced, but fieldwork allows new opportunities to appreciate personality, innovation, and improvisation. This isn't all new. There have been researchers who have been doing work like this for a while, including Jane Goodall and Franz de Waal. These scientists have frequently been accused of anthropomorphism, but whilst it is important to be aware of the dangers of projecting human norms and sensibilities onto others, multi-species studies scholars have also highlighted the promise of writing narratives that are rich with anecdote, metaphor, and figuration. As Val Plumwood argues, the charge of anthropomorphism shuts down discussion rather than opening up critical inquiry about how elements of a given trait may or may not be shared by non-humans. At the same time, as Eileen Christ has argued, efforts to adopt neutral language have themselves often been mechanomorphic, projecting characteristics of machines onto forms of life, or exhibited entrenched forms of what de Waal has called anthropo denial. Beyond the knowledge and practices of science, multi-species studies have sought out other approaches, aiming to decolonize and more broadly challenge dominant assumptions about knowledge, expertise, and who is authorized to speak for nature. For example, through working with and listening to Indigenous peoples, farmers, hunters, and artists' ways of understanding and engaging with the natural world. These approaches unsettle the hegemony of scientific accounts of nature, highlighting the complex and often contradictory ways of knowing, valuing, and living that are always unavoidably at play and at stake in the shaping of worlds. Rather than standing aloof from research subjects, multi-species studies aims to fully embrace observation as ongoing encounters in the world. Multi-species studies now go beyond making the biologists themselves the object of study to a truly collaborative approach, attempting to answer shared research questions. The results of this interdisciplinary approach are not unmediated knowledge. It requires responsible engagement, as the multiple perspectives involved in such research can lead to conflicting understandings, values, priorities, and ultimately worlds. In this context, it matters which questions we ask, which modes of inquiry we adopt, which practices of mediation, performance, making, and translation we employ, as well as which stories we tell. This practice is not just about creating diversity or accepting relativism. It is about, as Donna Haraway puts it, staying with the trouble to meaningfully navigate through the complexity. This makes it not just a scientific question, but an ethical and political one too. The complexity of this approach means not choosing between unconstructed realism and an easy relativism. Things are real in themselves, but also continually are shaped by dynamic interactions and different understandings. It is not about reducing all differences into one unified understanding, and it eschews generalization and abstraction. To do this research, one must be aware of the highly entangled biosocial multiplicity across generations. The distinction between self and other also becomes important. Without any notion of categorization and distinction, distinguishing between species, something the authors argue that non-human animals also do, would be impossible. However, the multi-species studies approach argues that species do not exist in bubbles, and instead examines how emergent multi-species assemblages undermine the idea of stasis and isolation. In doing this research of other non-human life, it also sheds new light on what it means to be human, as we also exist in and are created by a web of relations, for example with our own microbiome that helps us digest food. From this perspective, there is no human in isolation, no form of human life that has not arisen in dialogue with a wider world. This way of viewing bodies as assemblages breaks down the separation between interior bodies and external environments. The authors argue, therefore, that humans haven't departed from our biological origins, as some may believe, but exist in an extreme niche of that original state of nature. However, it is important to pay attention to how this is expressed differently for every human. Having escaped the tunnel vision of Anthropos, or to the great world beyond, multi-species studies scholars are also working to carefully avoid a reductive, homogenizing conceptualization of human life. While humans may all be connected to others, they are not all tangled up in the same ways. The specificity and proximity of connections matter. Histories of gender and race, of political economy and colonization are layers into multi-species worldings. How could they not be, shaping possibilities for everyone? No one is above or separate to the complex histories of humanity that have shaped all of our lives, and the multi-species studies approach argues that one must be in the world, not above it, to make a difference. The phrase "in the world" matters here. Work in multi-species studies begins from the proposition that there is no space outside the action from which to gain absolute or universal knowledge, and yet we must still act. In short, we shape worlds and are so responsible for what they become. As a result, multi-species studies has embraced relational ethical approaches to grapple with diverse competition claims of social justice, the well-being of individual non-humans, and the well-being of whole ecosystems and species. In this context, staying with the trouble means there are no neat and final answers here, and no easy relativisms allowed. This approach emphasizes the importance of learning to take others seriously in their otherness. This also means having to come to terms with and figure out a way of taking account of the fact that there are others who cannot or do not want to be understood by us. It is not that there is no right and wrong here, but that right and wrong are changeable and recrafted over and over within this process of ongoing questioning and effort to cultivate new modes of attentiveness. From this perspective, ethics is at the core of multi-species accounts, not an addition bolted onto the side. As Tom Van Doren and Deborah Bird Rose argue, ethology/ethnography is an act of bearing witness. Attention to others is vital to responding appropriately, while the telling of their stories also has the potential to draw others into new relationships and accountabilities. So the attentiveness of multi-species studies has two parts. One is the practice of getting to know each other in their intimate particularity, steadily applying one's observant faculties and energies, and the other is a practice of learning how one might better respond and might work to cultivate worlds of mutual flourishing. In short, the arts of attentiveness remind us that knowing and living are deeply entangled, and that paying attention can and should be the basis for crafting better possibilities for shared life. Okay,